And next we come to the maintenance of metabolism during environmental change, the part of Higher Biology, Unit 2, Metabolism and Survival. So we look at organisms which survive adverse conditions. Now, in extreme environments, conditions are not tolerable anymore, and homeostatic mechanisms can't do enough to maintain the internal steady state of the organism. But any cyclical seasonal fluctuations are not often fatal, because animals and other organisms are adapted to survive or avoid them. Any of these adaptations can be structural, like fur or feathers, physiological or behavioral, as we shall see. Firstly, dormancy involves a reduction in metabolic rate to avoid these adverse conditions and to prevent the overexpenditure of energy. And growth and development is temporarily arrested during these times. There's a couple of types of dormancy. There's predictive dormancy, which occurs before the arrival of adverse conditions. For example, hibernations. Trees will shed their leaves, etc., as a response to the reduced temperatures and the shortening day length. In terms of trees, the winter buds remain dormant until the favourable conditions return the following spring. There is also consequential dormancy, which occurs after the arrival of adverse conditions, such as estivation, usually in conditions of high temperature or drought. And so these conditions which bring about consequential dormancy are unpredictable, and often lots of organisms may die as a result. Dormancy in animals includes hibernation and estivation. Hibernation, or the winter sleep, responds to adverse winter conditions, an example of predictive dormancy. Usually the animals consume lots and lots of food before they go into hibernation, and during hibernation heart, breathing rate, metabolic rates drop, resulting in a big decrease in body temperature. Animals like hedgehogs, their body temperature drops to about 6 degrees C. Okay, but bears, for example, they don't really hibernate fully like other organisms. The body temperature drops to about 31 degrees C, and they can be roused quite easily. Estivation, otherwise known as the summer sleep, like mentioned before, it's a response to periods of excessive heat or drought, and these animals will become dormant until favourable conditions return, such as crocodiles. As you see in the picture, they're lungfish, which bury themselves in a little papery cocoon in the bottom of the mud, and waiting for the rains to return and the lakes or rivers to refill. Another example of a reduction in daily rate, but this is generally for small animals like hummingbirds or little rodents, is a daily torpor. So there's a reduction in metabolic rate every 24 hours, where the heart rates and the breathing rates and the body temperature reduces, just to avoid over expenditure of lots of energy. Another example, of course, where animals can survive these adverse conditions is by migrating, basically taking themselves away from those adverse conditions. But the actual triggers for migration could be changes in day length, shortage of food, or lowering of temperatures. Of course, famously, birds are known for their migrations. Arctic skua will migrate south in autumn to favourable conditions to the southern hemisphere and return following the same route the following spring. Yellow wagtails have a shorter migration, but still quite a long one, migrating from places like Britain across Europe down to sub-Saharan Africa to avoid the winter conditions in Britain. Mammals also migrate. Grey whales, they migrate south during the autumn to give birth in places like Baja, California. But there's not much food for the adults there. It's great for the babies because nice warm temperatures favour their growth. The mothers, they will suckle from the mothers, of course, during the early stages of growth, but there's not much food in those waters, and the parents, well, the mother will need to feed and in order to do so they have to migrate back up north during the spring, so that algal blooms lead to lots of food production in those more temperate waters in the north for the adults to feed. Invertebrates also migrate. A notable example is the monarch butterfly, which migrates between Mexico and the USA and Canada. However, what happens is it takes several generations for the monarchs to complete a single migration, but somehow that migratory information is passed down from parent to offspring. And the reason why they're migrating is they're following the growth of their preferred food, which is the milkweed plant. There are several techniques for monitoring animals whilst they migrate. So when the animals migrate, where they overwintered, and if they returned, and how long they migrated for. So we can use ringing, of course, a very traditional technique in birds, or tagging. There's a monarch butterfly carrying a tag. Colour marking and satellite tracking, like on like a satellite tracker attached to the back of that bird. Now, there are different types of migratory behaviour. There's innate behaviour. That's the behaviour that is inherited from your parents, and it's relatively inflexible. And it plays a primary role in migratory behaviour. There is, of course, learned behaviour, and this is gained through experience, and as such it's flexible behaviour. But this plays a secondary role in migratory behaviour. Now this can be shown with what's called displacement experiment. If we consider starlings which migrate from Eastern Europe to northern France, in the experiment some of these starlings were caught in Holland and were displaced due south to Switzerland. Now they were released in Switzerland, and what happened was the younger birds, being relatively inexperienced, just followed their innate behaviour and continued their migration in the same direction. However, the older birds, which were more experienced, used some of their learned behaviour, such as observing familiar landmarks, etc., to navigate their way to the actual migration grounds in northern France, where they were supposed to go. Now, another good example of innate behaviour is what's called directional tendencies in hand-reared black-capped warblers. So these birds have not had any contact with their parents. They've not been able to learn anything from their parents. Now there are two populations, A and B, in Europe, and when the birds were released, the birds taken from population A showed a tendency to go in a southwesterly direction, as is their wont, because these birds migrate to Spain and northern Africa. However, the birds taken from population B, when they were released in funnel cages, they showed a tendency to go southeast, which is what they would prefer, because they migrate to places like the Sudan and Ethiopia. If we now have a look at some cross-fostering experiments, so we can compare innate and learned behaviours in terms of migration. Herring gulls, for example, these are non-migratory birds, but lesser black-headed gulls are migratory. Now, if we take black-headed gulls reared by herring gulls, they still showed migratory behaviour, and that was their innate behaviour coming through. However, herring gulls reared by black-headed gulls also showed migratory behaviour. So this was an example of the herring gulls learning from their black-headed gulls' parents to migrate. Okay, that's it for this part of the unit. Okay, thank you very much.